Well, welcome, everyone. My name is Paul Leahy. I'm the newly appointed country manager for Click in Australia and New Zealand. I've been with Click for 4.5 years, and it's a real pleasure today to have you here for our webinar. And we've got a really special guest today. And today's topic's innovation and analytics strategy. And our speaker today is Donald Farmer. Donald's an internationally respected speaker and writer with over 30 years of experience in data management and analytics. He works globally with teams from the newest startups to some of the world's largest businesses. In addition to data and analytics strategy, Donald frequently consults on governance and compliance issues, particularly for companies implementing self-service architectures. He's also led teams at Microsoft and Click, building some of the most important and innovative analytics platforms on the market. And during this session, Donald will talk to you about how we can define and measure innovation in a very practical way, enabling teams to quickly and effectively become more innovative. We thought this topic was very timely, and we want to encourage you to ask questions during today's sessions. So to submit a question, simply type your questions into the Q&A window, and our presenters will answer those at the end of the session. So with that, we hope you really enjoy today's webinar, and I'm going to hand over to Donald, and then we'll open up for questions at the end. Thank you very much. Over to you, Donald.
Hey, thank you very much, Paul. Great to be here, and of course, under slightly strange circumstances, but I trust that everybody's keeping safe and well. I have cousins in Tasmania and in South New Zealand, and many friends in both countries, and I'm in touch quite a lot with people in the region. And I know it's tough. It's tough here in Seattle, but you know, this is also a very good time for us to be thinking about topics such as innovation and strategy, and how we are going to get the best out of our business, both just now and as we return to what will no doubt be a slightly different normal from what we've been used to before. So I'm very, very pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you today. The picture that you're seeing, my company that I'm now independent, and I do advisory work, as Paul said. My company is called Treehive Strategy. So my title slide is always a picture of the treehive, just so I can explain why this strange company title. And the treehive that you see is our beautiful treehouse that we haven't quite retreated in there and pulled up the bridge, but you know, if cases get any higher, maybe we'll think about doing that. But the topic today, very importantly, is innovation strategy and the role of analytics in innovation strategy. And it's a fascinating topic for me personally. I used to be the Vice President of Innovation and Design at Click, and we'll hear a little bit about what I did there during part of the conversation. And for me, one of the problems that I faced with innovation is that it's rather difficult to define. If you look up definitions of innovation in business books, very often you'll hear that it's about processes, you might hear that it's about people, and you might hear some sort of fairly vague definitions of what it's about, none of which really help you to be innovative. And yet, almost every company, every organization, whether government departments or private companies, they all want to be innovative in some way. And so what I've been working on for several years now is really a way of helping people to innovate, and starting with a definition of innovation that I think can really help people. But I'm going to start, first of all, with a definition of innovation that I think is no help at all. Actually, I think it's very negative. Very often when I ask people, what do they think innovation is, or how do they innovate, I get this answer, we have to think outside the box. And I have a little rule, I call it Farmer's Law. And Farmer's Law says that the usefulness of an idea is in inverse proportion to the cheesiness of the clip art that we use to communicate it. And I hate to say it, but thinking outside the box has generated some very, very cheesy clip art indeed. And that pretty much defines how useful that concept is. So I want to give you a more useful concept with no clip art, and we'll use that to explain what I think innovation is and to explain how that definition helps you to innovate. And then we're going to look at how we can then measure innovation and manage an innovation process. And so by the end of this webinar, I'd really like you to go away with some practical guidance, how you can be more innovative in your work and in other areas, how you can set up innovation projects and manage them and have a good handle on what successful innovation would look like within your organization. So my definition is actually fairly straightforward. For me, innovation is fresh work that emerges from radically new answers to the basic questions of our craft. And that's a slightly wordy for one sentence, but it's quite a concise definition. But every word here is important to me. And we'll go through this word by word, and you'll see how this definition builds up. And the point of this definition is that if you can remember it and work with it, that fresh work that emerges from radically new answers to the basic questions of our craft, then you can actually use this to help in your innovation process. To be innovative, perhaps I should start with the last word of this definition, craft. What do I mean by craft? Well, by craft, really, I mean anything that you do that you specialize in. That's really what I mean. So I don't necessarily mean just analytics. And sometimes we think of craft as being something you do with your hands. You're knitting or, painting or something. That's a craft. Woodwork is a craft for sure. And we normally think of it in those terms. But really our craft is whatever we're specializing in at that time. Your craft, for example, could be, if you're in manufacturing, that's your craft. If you are in finance, that's your craft. You might want to be a little careful about being innovative in finance, but it's possible. If you're in marketing, marketing is your craft. If you are in product development, or if you're a software developers quite often talk about the craft of software development. So what I'm really suggesting here is that you can be innovative in any field that you specialize in. Innovation doesn't mean technology. Innovation doesn't mean software or digital innovation. Innovation can be in any field that we as human beings practice. We can find new things to do. There are very innovative people working in woodwork, in knitting, in painting, all these examples that I gave. So I don't want us to limit this conversation, this thought about innovation to technology. But of course, technology is a large part of my subject area and my specialization. So some of my examples will come from there. Let's go back to the beginning of that word then. So having dealt with the last word first, let's deal with the first word. And the first word of my definition is fresh. Innovation is fresh work. What do I mean by fresh? Well, what I'm really getting at here is the idea that there is a limited period of time in which your innovation is innovative. And I'm comparing it here in the visuals to a fruit salad. And what I mean by that is, a fruit salad, when it's freshly served, looks pretty delicious and very tempting. If you've ever seen a fruit salad served at a conference, well, maybe by the time you get to the afternoon tea break, it's not looking quite so fresh and appetizing anymore. Fresh fruit has a very limited time in which it is fresh. And the MySpace example I want to suggest is that at one time MySpace was a very innovative company. It in fact was at the cutting edge of social networks and the use of digital social spaces online for people to communicate, to create friendships, to maintain friendships, and to exchange their daily work. And nowadays, who even knows that MySpace exists? It does actually still exist. It's still out there in some form. But it was innovative. but it was innovative for a very limited period of time. And other companies, other technologies, and other platforms have taken over from there. So this is the importance of being fresh. Your innovation has a very short time, surprisingly short, in which it is actually innovative. And nothing's very innovative for very long. So at one time, for example, when I was working with Click, having a browser-based analytics application, which we created in ClickSense, was very innovative. Nowadays, nearly everyone uses a browser-based analytics application, and Click is still very innovative in other ways, but that particular way is just now standard. So innovation often requires you to continually look for what is fresh in your area of specialization. And I didn't just say that it's fresh, I say that it's fresh work. And work is a word that we often don't want to hear. I'm telling you that innovation is not just fresh work, it's actually quite hard work. I think it was, I've heard it described to various people, to Graham Bell, to Edison, that invention is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. It might be a slight advantage, but I do want to emphasize that innovation requires work. It requires you to be actually creating something or bringing something forth into the world and not just having an idea. Anyone can have an idea. It's pretty straightforward. I have lots of ideas. The number of times you wake up in the morning and you've had a dream about the perfect movie script, or you've had the storyline of the perfect novel that you're going to write, or some great idea in business comes to you while you're in the bath. And the truth is, if you don't do the work to create it, then it was never really an innovative idea. It was just a concept that went nowhere. And then I look at these crazy patents. It's always great fun to go and look at the patent websites and explore some of the crazy patents that are out there. There's a vacuum cleaner disguised as a dog, which was actually invented specifically to make vacuum cleaners more attractive, something that you would have around the house without it looking out of place. There's a device for gentlemen to be able to lift hats to when they meet ladies in the street, so that they, if they're carrying boxes or something, they'll be able to, still tip their hat to the lady. I don't know what's going on with the siphon and the blocked toilet. I really don't think I want to know about it. But at the same time, all these patents were granted. But here's a funny thing. It's all very well having a patent granted. If you haven't done the work to build the product, it's still just an idea. And the secret to innovation is to bring the idea forth into the world as a real object. So it doesn't matter if it's a crazy idea. If you do the work, then you're being innovative. And I can give you an example of somebody who did the work. I always find this one quite amusing. The Wonder Sauna hot pants, which clearly somebody at some time thought was a great idea. There we are. It's got an endorsement from Health Watchers of America. Somebody has done the work to build this. Somebody's done the work to design it, to manufacture it, to test it. I sincerely hope they tested it, let me put it that way. Somebody's done the work to market it, to set a price, to design the packaging, and somebody's brought this forth into the world and brought it to market. And we may think it's the craziest idea we ever saw, but it's innovative, and somebody, as they put the effort in and did work in their craft. And that matters. And by the way, just to reinforce how much work they've done, indeed, Wonder Sauna hot pants are still available today. Admittedly, in a completely new, radical design, but they're available on Amazon. Only 11 left in stock, so hurry now. I don't know how far they deliver, but I guess I kind of took this snapshot last year. But here they are. They're still there. Somebody's continued to do the work on this concept. They've continued to iterate through it and create new versions. So I'm afraid, crazy idea though it seems, Wonder Sauna hot pants are here to stay and count as an innovative concept. So it's fresh and it's work. This is very important. The second aspect of this that I think I often refer to is the importance of emergence. And what I mean by emerges is sometimes it's a little technical to talk about emergence. But if you're a physicist, for example, or a chemist, you're probably used to the idea of an emergent property. And an emergent property is one where essentially we could sum it up by saying that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's not just putting one thing together with another thing and therefore getting one conjoined thing. It's actually that something new emerges from that. So larger entities arise from interaction of simpler entities, but they now have new properties that the simpler entities themselves did not exhibit. Now, what I mean by something that emerges then is that it's not just a straight line design of one thing and another. Let me show you an example. I think this makes it a little clearer because I admit that the language is a little complicated. The lawnmower. The lawnmower is a great piece of design. And we'll talk about the lawnmower as an example in a bit of detail later on. But I used to have to cut the grass on a Sunday afternoon. My parents would come home from church. We'd have a big lunch, always a big Sunday lunch, roast lunch. And then they'd fall asleep, typically fall asleep in the living room on the couch. And my job was to go out and cut the grass with a mower. And I had a push mower like this because they didn't want an electric or a gas mower that would wake them up. So I had a little push mower. What I didn't have was the vacuum cleaner, the garden vacuum, to sweep up all these things. So I also had to do that by hand. But nowadays, fairly common, you would have a lawnmower and you would have the vacuum to help clean up the grass cuttings or the leaves or whatever. Now, I could absolutely put these things together. Nowadays, you can get lawn vacuums. You can get lawnmowers with bags built in, of course. You get lawnmowers with vacuums built in. You put these things together. They're not particularly innovative. However, there is innovation in lawn mowing. A few years ago, people started to design the electric sheep mower, which in fact continually moves around the lawn, cutting the grass, just like a sheep nibbles the grass. And of course, this is a prototype and a rather silly prototype, but you can buy them. They're made now by Husqvarna and by Bosch and by Hitachi, and all sorts of companies make these. This is a solar-powered mower which goes out and continuously cuts the grass. It has an app which can control it. And what's interesting about this model for me when it comes to innovation is that you don't get to this by just adding a vacuum cleaner and a mower together. You have a mower and you have a vacuum. What they've actually done is brought that together. Oops, and I'm hearing from Lisa that we're still on the sheep slide, so it's going to take a few seconds to synchronize. But and what you will see now is the rather stylish electric mower, which has got an app to control it and has all the latest kind of features and gadgets. And my point is that you don't design this by taking a mower and a vacuum and putting them together. What you do if you take a mower and a vacuum and put them together is you design a mower and vacuum. What you get when you think about the problem in more detail is something that emerges from that thinking, which is a new technology. And we'll talk a little more about how that technology can emerge later on. But for now, let's just say that this is the critical point of this, that the fresh work isn't just putting things together and coming up with a new idea. It's a new idea which emerges from our previous concepts. And that emergent property, I'm going to suggest, comes from what I call the radical new answers. Radical new answers is a little difficult to define as well, but again, examples will make it work. One of my favorite examples of something that you can use radically or a radical new answer. We talked about lawnmowers already. Let me talk about hair dryers. And hair dryers are kind of interesting because a hair dryer is really a very simple device, and it's been around for a very long time. Hair dryers were invented, I think, in the sort of 1920s, especially the electric ones. And the great thing about the hairdryer is that it seems to have a single purpose. It seems to have just a single purpose, which is that if you use it in the bathroom, you use it in the bedroom, you use it at the hair salon, the purpose of hairdryer is in fact to dry hair. But if you think about the models that you can see on screen now, the one on the left-hand side, the kind of black and white picture, is clearly for drying hair. It's actually shaped to go around the head. It's actually shaped to fit around a 1920s hairstyle. That's the purpose of it. It's clearly a hairdryer. The other device, however, is doing something else. The other device is blowing hot air at the lady, which is what hairdryers do. But interestingly, once you take the concept of a hairdryer and say, how is it working? Well, it's working by blowing hot air. Now you can have all sorts of questions about, well, what else could I do with it? And now it's no longer a hairdryer, it's a hot air blower, which then leads you in a new direction, potentially an innovative new direction, in order to use it in a different way. So, for example, when I lived in Scotland and I had an old car which wouldn't start very well, I can remember, running an extension cord from the house and sticking a hairdryer in and putting the hairdryer in the air intake of the car to give it some warm air on a cold day to try and get started, which actually worked remarkably well. So what I was doing there was using a hairdryer, not as a hairdryer, but as a hot air blower. And of course, there are silly examples here of somebody drying some jeans probably in a hotel room with a hairdryer, or somebody using it with a screwdriver to ice a cake. My point being that once you actually think about the hairdryer, not as a hairdryer, but as a fundamental question of what is it doing, then you can start to rebuild a concept from that, and that new concept can take you in an innovative and fresh direction. So that's what I mean by a radical new answer. And it's a radical new answer to what I call the basic questions. And what are the basic questions? Well, the basic questions of our craft, I like to come back to what the journalists often describe as being the 6 friends of the journalists, which are 6 questions that you should be able to ask and get answered in any good news story, which is who, what, where, when, why, and how. And these are often called the 6 friends. I'd actually add another one to that, because if we're talking about innovation, especially in the commercial field, you might ask a question like, how much? Would be a good one. And what I mean by radical new answer to these questions is that you can take these questions and answer them in a new way. And if you can answer 1 or 2 of these questions in a new way, then you can see something in that answer that will take you in a new direction. So let me take a simple example from our history at Click. When I worked at Click, when I started to work with Click, the idea of business intelligence had been around for some years. Business intelligence was something that was built by IT departments. Very often there were specialized analysts. It took quite a lot of work to build dashboards, to build reports, to deploy them. And at Click, they had a radical new idea, a basic question of who builds business intelligence. And they answered that in a radically new way, which was not specialists, but everybody who wants it can build business intelligence. Now, when I started working in business intelligence back in the 90s, that would have been a crazy answer, because nobody could do that, because it was a technical and difficult field that required, more access to data and technology than everyone had. But Click came along and said, you know what, everyone can do this. And that's a radical answer to the question of who. And now, having thought about that answer, you build that product, you have something which is genuinely innovative. Another interesting question would be, where do you do this work? And if we think of business intelligence, we could say, well, you do it anywhere. You do it on a mobile device. And at one time, even Click would have thought that was difficult, because Click was an in-memory application and therefore was limited to desktop machines which had lots of memory. And then we come along and say, well, no, we'll do it in the cloud, and it'll be a mobile device. And you can start to do real analytics on a mobile device, and you can do it anywhere. You can do it in the field. You can do it with a handheld device as you walk between wards in a hospital rather than having to log into a system every time you stop. And that where analysis, that change in where is radical and can lead to new innovation, which kind of brings me back to the example of the lawnmower, which I think I said was this kind of chat task that I had as a child. When I mowed the lawn as a child, there was a time that I did it. I did it on Sunday afternoons while my parent was sleeping. There was a who question. There was who did it? Well, Donald did it. That was his task. There was a how question. I had my machine that I used, my push mower. There's actually the when question, the time question, isn't just that I did it on Sunday afternoon, but my task, my chore, lasted for a particular length of time. There was a time when I was doing that chore, and then I stopped and I went and did something else. So there was a time box in which I did the work. There was a period of time in which it was scheduled. There was a person who did it. And I could take all these basic questions and I can transform them with new answers. So I could say, who cuts the grass now? No one. It's a very radical answer. No one cuts the grass because it's done automatically. When is it done? Well, not on Sunday afternoon because my electric sheep style lawnmower is continuously cutting it, nibbling at the grass and doing that. So there's no answer to who. There's a radical answer to when. How it happens is also radically being changed because rather than cutting the grass all at once, it's just nibbling the grass and cutting it continuously, but with very small cuts rather than doing kind of one large cut once a week, and so on. I can take these different questions and give radical new answers. Now, to be clear, you don't need to give radical new answers to every question. You only need to give radical answers to one or two to be innovative. But I find it a very, very interesting subject. I'll give you one more example, and then we'll chat a little bit more about how we can actually apply this work in our analytics field. So many of you who know Click very well, and maybe you've attended Click conferences, or you've looked at Click webinars, or you had any interactions, will know Todd Margolis from Click. And Todd and I worked together, had a great time working together at Click, actually. And one day we went to visit a very famous designer called Don Norman, a guy who had worked with Apple for many years, had been the designer of many radical products, and has written some very important books on design, such as The Design of Everyday Things. And when we went to visit Don in his office in San Diego, we saw, rather amusingly, written on his whiteboard, the phrase, in fact, there was nothing else written on the whiteboard. All that was written there was the phrase, the car is an accessory to the smartphone. And we thought this was very curious, and we said, what does this mean? And Don's answer said, how did you get here today? And I said, well, I flew from Seattle. I met Todd at the airport. He flew from San Francisco. We took an Uber. And he said, there you go. You came here by phone. You called a car by phone. You used an app. So the car didn't get you here. It was really your phone that got you here. The car was just the way that the phone happened to do it. But really, you got here by phone. And I thought that's a very, very interesting twist on the way I would normally have thought about it. I would normally have thought of the phone as being an accessory for calling the car, but he said, no, really the important thing is the phone. In other words, he's taking one of these basic questions and giving it a really radical new answer. So in your work, you absolutely could look at the work that you do today and start to ask some of these basic questions. So for example, if you were thinking of analytics, who does analytics in your business? Maybe other people should be doing analytics, maybe not just the people who are doing it just now. How did he do it? Is there another way of doing it? Where did he do it? Is mobile a possibility for you? Why did he do it? What's the purpose of analytics? Well, maybe there's a radically different purpose. I did a very, very interesting project to do analytics for a car manufacturer in the US who was very concerned at absenteeism in the workplace. And they were very concerned that people just weren't turning up for work, especially on occasions like big sporting events. They would often be, taking time off on the day of the sporting event or sometimes the day after the sporting event. And it was very difficult for the company to plan when people were absent. And so they wanted to create a dashboard that was going to track all this, and then they would identify the people who were absent more often than others, and maybe try and persuade them or discipline them even about coming back to work. And we had a long conversation about the design of these dashboards, and we came up with a different idea. And the different idea was, rather than using this as a way to sort of discipline or punish people, why don't we turn the dashboard the other way around? Rather than looking at how much time and energy and work the company is losing, why don't we create a dashboard about how much money the people who are taking time off are losing because they're not turning up? And here's the overtime they're missing, and here is the wages that they're missing out on, so that at the end of the month and at the end of the year, they can actually see the impact of their absenteeism, not on the car manufacturer, but on them themselves. And so rather than turning it into a sort of dashboard for managers, we turned it into a dashboard for employees who could then see the impact of their own decisions on their own work. And I think that was a very, very innovative approach to the problem of absenteeism. And it actually had quite a radical effect. We were able to reduce absenteeism in that company by 25% after the rollout of this dashboard, and some other things like seminars that we ran and other things to get the message home. But it was a very important component and a very interesting idea of completely inverting the problem of absenteeism. It's not a problem for the company, it's a problem for the worker. And that seemed to me kind of very innovative approach, and the sort of thing that you might be able to do in your own company is thinking about these basic questions and coming up with radical new answers for them. So that's why my definition is important to me. That's why that definition to me is critical, that it's fresh work that emerges from radical new answers to the basic questions of our craft. And now I want to talk a little bit about how we manage that process and how we would analyze that process, because we are all analysts in our business. We're all working with data. And I want to suggest that there's a number of things that we can do. One of the first things, however, that we have to get in mind is that there are some top-down requirements. The first set of top-down requirements are leadership has to embrace innovation. It's very difficult for any organization to be innovative if there's not a kind of leadership quality. There's not a kind of sign from leadership that this is important to them. So when we talk about how we analyze innovation, when we talk about how we run an innovation process, one of the key elements of that is the leadership bought in, and are the leaders in your organization actually promoting innovation as a value and as a process? And to do that, they have to do things which are actually quite difficult for leaders. They have to embrace risk and failure. Innovation includes quite a lot of risk, includes quite a lot of failure. And we can set targets and incentives around that. At one point, when I became the VP of Innovation and Design at Click, I started to work with a team that had been around for a couple of years, working in the labs in London, doing experimental work and developing some experimental features. And when I took over that team, one of the things they wanted to show me was, let's show you all the stuff that we've been working on. And how do you incentivize a labs team? Well, they work on new projects. And if they work on new projects, then that ties into their bonus. And so they showed me all their projects, and I had a good look at them and said, all these projects have been successful. And they said, yeah, we're very pleased with it. And I said, well, if all your projects have been successful, that means you're not trying hard enough. If all your projects are being successful, you're not being innovative enough, because being innovative involves a risk of failure. And if you're not failing, perhaps you're not innovating. So perhaps you don't get a bonus because all your projects worked. And now you can imagine the reaction to that. People looked at me as if I was crazy, but all our projects were successful. We don't get a bonus. Of course, I was joking, but I wanted to make a serious point that innovation involves taking risk, and that involves accepting that some of those risks are going to fail. And part of our process is how we manage that. So in innovation, we have to allow space and openness. That's also really important for me. There is space to innovate, and there's the openness to innovate. Now, by space, you might actually mean physical space. The labs in London had a physical space called the labs where you could work. But you could also think of it as time. We'll allow time for people to innovate. We'll allow, and openness means, well, just the openness to where innovation can come from. Because innovation can come, as I said, from any craft. It can come from anywhere in your organization. The idea that it must be your labs and they're the only people who can innovate just isn't true. You have to be open to innovation, to innovative voices from other, from anywhere in your organization where innovation might come from. Which leads then to, I think, some very important questions about where do we actually put our investment when we want to innovate. And I split the question of investment down into kind of three different areas. The first thing is that, of course, we might want to look at something like, the market intelligence. So if you're open to innovation, one of the things that you would want to look at is what's going on in the market. What are the trends in the market? And, what can we do with those? Where are they going? But I'm going to challenge that view a little bit. There's a reason I have pictures of 5 smartphones, which is at one time, the smartphone was an innovative device. The iPhone was very innovative. And if you looked at the trends and you looked at the patterns of smartphones, you'd see that they become smaller, they become more powerful, they add better cameras, they add more memory. But all of those are trends that anyone can look at using market intelligence and come up with basically the same answers. Oh, we want better cameras, we want more storage, and so on. In other words, what you'll get from that is time-sensitive innovation which is at the very most going to be fresh for a very short period of time. And remember how important it was that freshness should be a part of our innovative process. So the next thing I want to suggest is that looking just at market intelligence and trends will only take you so far. What you really need to look at is something which is actually more fundamental. You need to get down to the basic questions and ask questions about cultural intelligence. What's happening in society? And then what are our values and what's changing in the social world? And how can we design with that in mind? And of course, right now, we're living in a period of very, very radical social change, imposed on us, if you like, and coming in the form of a crisis. But that's exactly where people who understand the cultural values of social change will be the most innovative. People who are being ahead of the curve in thinking of what's it like to work remotely, what's it like to work in this sort of disconnected way from other people, what's it like to invest in supply chains that are more robust or which have a lot of alternatives in the supply chain. Recently, for example, it's been a trend in supply chain analytics to say what's the most efficient supply chain? And the question has often been answered as, well, it's the one which has got the fewest items in it at any one time. In other words, the supply chain which is just in time, and where the smallest number of goods, the smallest number of components, the smallest number of items are running through the supply chain at any one time in order to be most efficient. And now it turns out in the middle of a crisis, maybe that's not the right answer after all. Maybe the right answer was having more redundancy in the supply chain, which would have made you less efficient at one point, but perhaps in the longer term more efficient. So what I'm getting at here is that we have to think not just about market intelligence, but profoundly we need to think about cultural intelligence and our values and how society is changing for innovation to come out of that. Now, one of the things about measuring innovation is that everybody wants to do it. There's a number. I always like to share the number. I wonder if you can guess what it is. What percentage of CEOs actually think innovation is important to their company? And I think that's always an interesting question, because the The answer is actually pretty radical. Almost every CEO I talk to, but of course I'm talking about innovation strategy, certainly says that innovation is important. But there was a survey done by Fast Company magazine, and they asked a large number of CEOs around the world, how important is innovation to you? And it turned out that 70% of CEOs said that innovation is a top priority. Innovation is a top 3 priority for our company. But then you ask them, well, how many of you are measuring innovation? It's your top priority. What are you doing about it? And it turns out that only 22% are actually measuring innovation in any way. So for 70% of CEOs, it's a priority. 22% are doing something about it in terms of analyzing the process. And when I talk to CEOs about this, the number one reason I discover that they are not measuring innovation is because they don't know how. They literally don't know what metrics they should use for measuring innovation. So I'm going to give you some metrics. I'm going to suggest some that you can use. And my first metric I think is useful is you can measure openness. And by that I mean you can measure the projects that are created. Are you open to doing innovation projects with customers or partners? How many of your customers and partners are involved in evaluating your innovation? And how many of your employees have actually been trained in innovation so that they can contribute, remembering that innovation may come from almost anywhere in your organization? So these are 3 very simple measures. Are your employees trained? How many of them are? How many customers and partners are involved? And how many customer partners are co-creating with you? By the way, some people ask about the slide here. The slide is an illustration of the English potter, Josiah Wedgwood, Wedgwood pottery. And if you ever read about him, if you ever want to read about somebody who is an innovative inventor in business, don't read about Steve Jobs. Go and read about Josiah Wedgwood. He is probably the most innovative person in business, I think, in 200 or 300 years. He didn't just invent new forms of clay and new forms of pottery and new designs. He invented mail order catalogs in order for people to be able to order his designs remotely. He invested in railways. He invested in railways because railways by their nature are smoother running and therefore better able to deliver pottery without it being broken than delivering it in a horse and cart. He was an extraordinarily innovative inventor, and if you're interested in the history of innovation, I suggest following up on Josiah Wedgwood. I think he's a great person. So those are things you can measure. You can measure how many people are involved in the innovation, both customers and partners and employees. You can also measure, and I remember if I said that two of the things that you need are openness and space, you can also measure the space that you allow for innovation. So for example, you can think about space as being, do we have labs? Do we have time set up for people? How much time do our employees actually spend on innovation? Do we have teams that are especially set up for it? And I think that's actually quite an important and useful value. Another thing you can measure is, well, do we have experiments? Do we have prototypes in action? One of the slide I use here is BMW. This is going to be different this year, but BMW have, like many car manufacturers, they have a goal to show 3 new prototypes at the Geneva Motor Show every year. Now this year there probably won't be a Geneva Motor Show, but that's a simple plan. They need 3 new concept cars at the Geneva Motor Show every year. This is the BMW i8 concept, their electric sports car, which they, of course, delivered. It's available. And great car it is, too. Very, very high-performance sports car. But they actually have this measure. It's a very simple measure. We will have 3 cars, 3 radical new concepts every year. And for a company that wants to stay at the front of their business, that's a very important thing. But remember also that I talked about failure. And I talked about the importance of being open to failure. Well, it's all very well to say that we're open to failure, but how can we be smart about it? Well, we have to be analytic about it. And therefore, it's important also to have measures of the projects which have to be cancelled, the projects which fail, You could have the measures of incentives that were awarded. You can measure IP and patents, all ways of measuring things that succeeded. But also think of the alternative. Did we have ideas which didn't make it to be patented? Do we have ideas which didn't make it to be rewarded? But those are still valuable things. One of my clients that I work with, every year they run a competition amongst their employees. There are 16 ideas, which ultimately are pruned down to 4 ideas. And then the 4 ideas go into an experimental phase, and then 2 ideas come out. And then one of those ideas goes forward and actually becomes their innovation project for the year, which gets taken out to their customers. What's interesting to me is that everybody who comes up with one of the 16 top ideas is incented and rewarded for doing that. That's also important. It's important, just as important to understand your failures as your successes. And then we have, of course, the question of having come up with some innovative ideas, having measured our successes, measured our failures, actually come up with these projects. How do we take them to market? And I think one of the normal ways of thinking about this in the business space, if we're talking about commercial projects, is there a demand, and is it feasible to build something which meets the demand? In other words, is there a customer space there? And have we built something? Can we build something that meets the customer demand? Interestingly, I think that might be the wrong way around. In a genuinely innovative world, looking at a customer demand and then looking whether you can meet that means that you're only ever chasing your customers. And your business is to be innovative. Your business is to be ahead of your customers. So following customer demand is really the same as following the market trends. You're just going where everybody else could be going. And it's fine. You can take, customer requirements. I guarantee you, if you have a room full of smart people taking customer requirements, your competitors, your clients, anybody else in the industry can have a room full of smart people taking customer requirements. What's really interesting is when you can perhaps do this the other way around. Come up with an idea that it's possible to build. Come up with an idea that you think you can build effectively, that you can make cost effective, and then take that and see if there is actually a demand for it. In other words, rather than looking for the demand and then the feasibility, in a really innovative business, we start with feasibility. We work out if there's a demand for this thing that we can build. And then we actually add another very important question, which is it viable? And viable is a little bit different from feasibility. Feasibility is, can we make it work? Can we build it? Demand is, do people want it? Viability is, can we make it work? Can we sell it? Can we deliver it in a way that we can, in the crudest terms, in a way that we can make money from it, or in a way that is effective and sustainable for our business, whatever the metrics of our business happens to be. If we're in a public service organization, viability for us may be, can we do it economically? Can we do it in a sustainable way? But I want you to think of this pattern. There's a demand, there's a feasibility, there's viability. And really, in innovation, we start with feasibility, and then we establish if there's demand, and then we look at the viability of that field. So what I hope I've been able to describe to you here is the outline of a process. And to be fair, I've tried to do in 3/4 of an hour what normally we spend an entire day with worked examples and workshops and, taking examples from your business and thinking through what the basic questions mean for you and taking examples of what openness and space and failure and demand and viability would mean in your business context. But what I'm really trying to get across to you is that there is a way of doing this. You'll get the slides here. Those of you who are online, you'll also get access to a little ebook that I've written, which goes through this process as well and describes a lot about that. But if you come away with one thing, I think what I'd like you to remember is that innovation is practical. It's something you can do. And this definition actually helps you to sit down and innovate. If you remember that it's fresh work, that emerges from radical new answers to the basic questions of our craft. And that's really the essence of what I wanted to get across to you today. Now, we have some time towards the end for question and answer, and I think we can flip over and see if we have any questions, or see if anyone has any they would like to ask now.
Yeah, thank you, Donald. That was great. I really like that definition. I was a little confronted by a couple of your possible innovation, the toilet scene, and the. I'm trying not to think about that too much, but I
know you've
really
been online and you're ordering a set of Wonder Sauna hot pants right now, aren't you?
I'm going to try and avoid those, I think. But really thought-provoking, and I think especially during this sort of challenging time, as you talked about at the beginning, that in business now, all of us are having to try and innovate to adapt to the current situation and being open to new ideas about how to work. And I think trying to instill, it's a great opportunity for businesses to rethink how they work and try to put in place those supporting measures around implementing a culture of innovation. So I think we might have now one question in the panel there. And
right, always address questions. Oh, here we go. Yeah.
How about I'll read it out. I'll put it to you.
Sure.
So the question is, when many organizations fund technology change by project or burning platform, how can you retrofit these concepts? When and where to introduce them? That's an interesting question.
It is. It's one of the. This is really comes up against two problems. First of all, the openness to failure. And funding and failure are two terms that people really don't want to hear in the same sentence. But to be fair, you have to be open to the possibility of failure with an innovation. But the other thing it comes up against is how do we get, the idea of kind of retrofitting that idea. The challenge for anyone introducing innovation in an organization is, where is it going to be most valuable, and where is it going to be most acceptable? And it's very tempting to look at the areas such as, something that's just customer facing, something which is to do with sales, for example, or something which is to do with product. And of course, those are areas where you may want to be innovative. But companies can also build their innovation DNA by innovating internally. Very often you actually get, I did some really interesting work, for example, within HR, and the project I was talking about absenteeism was an example where there was great value, but the innovation was entirely internal, if you like, an entirely internal process. So trying to find the right project and trying to find a project which has, acceptable degree of failure is a bit of an art within a program, but you don't need to think of it as something which is either expensive or necessarily customer facing. You can build your innovative muscles, if you like, within an organization on internal projects as well as external. Yeah,
and I think part of that is, one of the measures you said was, around openness. So openness means being flexible about the order of operations, and sometimes you have to be thinking innovatively, perhaps, and maybe the innovation comes later, and then maybe the return comes later as well. But you have to have that sort of openness to do those things. We've got another question, Donald. So the question is, can you change the order of feasibility, demand, and viability to be viability, demand, and feasibility? Should you want to know if something is viable first, then what the demand is, and finally feasible?
So this sounds like somebody who doesn't want to be open to too much risk. Um, if you want to make sure it's viable before, but I'm being only slightly joking. It's difficult to know if something's viable without actually assessing the demand and whether you can build it. Because really viability is I give you a great example of this. There are people who have built very practical, innovative projects and innovative technologies, which they have not been able to sell, partly because maybe the demand is not there, but sometimes they can't sell them at the right price. The cost of building it just isn't enough. I had a friend of mine actually who developed a really interesting technology for water bottles. It was a kind of self-sanitizing water bottle for hikers and climbers and things like that. And there was definitely a demand, but it turned out that he couldn't build the technology and make it viable. His company ran for about 6 months, but ultimately it was just too expensive of a water bottle. Turned out people would rather buy a couple of tablets for pennies and drop them in the water, even if the water tasted disgusting, rather than using his technology. So it was definitely feasible. The technology worked. There was a demand, but he couldn't make it viable because he couldn't sell it at that price. And that's really why I think of it in that order. If he'd been thinking in terms of viability first, sure, he could have done some market research and found out what people were, willing to pay. But then the interesting problem with that is that if you have a product which is innovative and exciting, sometimes people are willing to pay much more than you might imagine. The first iPhone, for example, was ridiculously expensive and yet was very successful because it wasn't even a very good phone, as I remember. But people were willing to pay for it. So I think is it feasible? Is there a demand, and is it viable? I'm going to stick with that ordering. I think, there are circumstances, and especially where funding is tight, or sometimes in public organizations with very fixed budgets, where you might want to play around with that ordering. That might be okay. But I think in the commercial world, I'm going to stick with feasibility, demand, and viability in that order.
Yeah. A great example. I like the example. It's a really good example. It's a practical one, and good answer. Thanks, Donald. Does anyone else have any other questions for Donald? You can use the panel, the Q&A panel, if you're not sure. So that's down at the bottom. You can just click on that, and then you can click on the plus sign to add a question if you've got a question. We've got a couple more minutes left. Donald, I might just ask one final question before we sign off. So you mentioned a number of individuals, and you talked about Click in terms of being innovative around self-service and business intelligence. Are there any particular organizations now that strike you as being particularly models for implementing innovation?
So, there's some really fascinating organizations. Of course, everybody's trying to be innovative right now. right at this moment, there are people out there trying desperately hard to be innovative. I'm going to say, if you look in your region, I've been very impressed with, for example, with what, say, the New Zealand Office of Statistics has been doing in terms of making data available to the public. And this openness, these open data projects are actually very innovative. And then in other organizations, I think, those are ways in which we can be innovative, in which you can find, public innovation, which is quite exciting. Yeah.
Oh, that's terrific.
Right. Time to wrap
Donald,
up,
thank you. I think it's time to wrap up. So, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate that. It was very thought-provoking. Love the examples. And I think we've got a little bit of feedback, not a question, but someone saying, great presentation, Donald. But it is the top of the hour. We really Appreciate your time, Donald. And as Donald said, there will be some information available for all the attendees, and you'll get that via email. But Donald, thanks again for your time. Really appreciate that. And we look forward to having you on future webinars.
Great. Thank you very much.